My Schizophrenic Life, The True Story of Tracy Poe, Part 5, WestPac 84, Part 2, Chapter 21, Philippines Second Time. We went to the Philippines again in late September 1983. We were at sea for about 24 days. When Marines are at sea, they get paid every 2 weeks in cash on the ship. So, when we got to the Philippines, we all had money as we were at sea for 2 pay periods. We were there for 2 weeks. Most Marines would get a steady girlfriend while in port for several days. I did not spend my money on women, which is where most Marines spent their money, so I had extra cash on me. About 7 days into our Liberty call in the Philippines, the second time, men in Bravo Battery were running out of money. So, I started loan sharking. What the loan sharks did was keep a paper with how much they loaned out and the name of the Marine they loaned it to. Most loan sharks had the rate of $20 for $30, meaning they loaned out $20 and got paid back $30. On the paper that the loan shark kept, he would simply write down that he had loaned out $30 and command was okay with this and would support you if someone refused to pay you back. At the 20 for 30 rate, Marines were reluctant to borrow money. So, I loaned at a rate of $20 for $25, and a lot of my fellow batterymen borrowed from me. I had an extensive list of names of people that owed me $25. It was easy to get your money back because they paid in cash on the ship, and we would line up down a hallway leading to a desk where the money was dispersed. I would get in the back of the line and catch my borrowers as they walked back out of the line after getting paid. I had about $500 to loan out, and I made about $125 every time I did this. I did this 4 times, at each new port we went to. During the deployment, I would loan money, and by the end of the float, I had made about $500 profit. Pendleton and I had found a bar we liked that was down a side street off Magsaysay Drive. It was tiny and was called Freak Stagger Inn. Its name was based on the underground comic books called Freak Brothers. The bar owner was a guy named Roger, and he claimed to have the coldest San Miguel beer in Olongapo. Lance Corporal Pregler from the FDC, Fire Direction Control Platoon, also would spend time together there with us, as did Grom, Lance Corporal Ingram. We would just spend time together and drink San Miguel beer and pitchers of Mojo. Street vendors would walk down these back streets catering to locals. A guy who walked by often had a stick with a bucket on either end and would honk a horn and say, "Balut." Balut is a chicken embryo cooked in an egg. We never ate them, but the guy also had hard-boiled quail eggs that we called bird eggs, and we would get those and eat them at Freak Stagger Inn. The guy would give us a little pile of rock salt to go with the eggs. They were delicious. One time, while at Freak Stagger in Pendleton and I had already had a lot to drink, Grom and Lightman were there playing pool on the table that barely fit in the room behind the balcony where we always spent time together. We decided to get a pitcher of Mojo, but I pretended to drink it and let Pendleton drink the whole pitcher himself. We were already drunk before this, so Pendleton was wasted. He threw up in a potted plant beside him on the balcony. We decided to leave. Lightman and Grom had to hold him up to get him to walk. They were on either side of Pendleton with their arms around his shoulders, dragging him down the street. Pendleton was growling at everybody he passed. We had rented some rooms at a hotel earlier, and we were taking him there. I was watching out for the shore patrol, who did courtesy pickups where they took drunk servicemen back to base with no repercussions. We got Pendleton to the hotel and into his room. I went into my room and passed out watching a wobbly ceiling fan. The next morning, I woke up and went to Pendleton's room. I knocked on his door and he came out with a wild look in his eyes. He had dried vomit all down the side of his shirt. To go on Liberty in town, Marines had to wear a collared shirt. Pendleton took off his vomit-covered shirt and put on a Freak Stagger Inn t-shirt he had bought the night before. We walked back to the ship, and I, always wanting to follow the rules and be a good guy, was paranoid that he would get caught and someone would say something about him being in town in a t-shirt. But we made it back to the ship with no problems. Again, we sailed out of Subic Bay, but this time headed south. Chapter 22. WOG Day. We were sailing south on the USS Cleveland LPD-7 in October of 1983, and were getting ready for when we would cross the equator and all the people who had never been across before would be initiated by all those who had crossed before. This was called WOG Day. WOGs were the ones who had never crossed the equator before, and once you did cross the equator, you became a shellback. The day before we were going to cross, the shellbacks began to hold court, led by Staff Sergeant Spittler. We were brought into a compartment where the shellbacks set up a court, and we were questioned about silly things, but in a menacing tone. Then the whole ship began to vibrate. I went topside, and by the time I got up there, we were dead in the water, and there was a sailor with an M14 assault rifle standing watch as a diver was under the ship inspecting the propellers. The sailor with the rifle was watching for sharks. We had hit a giant teak log and bent our propeller. Sailors on the back of the boat on fantail watch reported that the giant log shot at least 10 feet out of the water when we hit it. It had bent the propeller of the ship. We were back down below in our berthing compartment when we got even worse news. On October 23, 1983, a terrorist bomber driving a truck had blown up the Marine Corps barracks in Lebanon, flattening the building. 220 Marines, 18 sailors, and 3 Army personnel had lost their lives to this terrorist attack. We were to pack up at once and prepare to cross deck by helicopter to the USS Peleliu LHA-5. We put all our extra personal belongings in a few big metal storage boxes and locked them. Then we gathered our gear and checked out our weapons from the armory, and that night waited below in the well deck of the USS Cleveland LPD-7 for dawn. We slept on our gear that night down there on the well deck. At dawn, the 4x4 forklifts started hauling our howitzers up the ramp to the flight deck, where they were picked up by CH-53 Sea Stallion helicopters and taken to the USS Peleliu LHA-5. They also hauled up several storage boxes of gear and ammunition. Then it was our turn. I had my deuce, combat gear on, helmet and H-harness with canteens, ammo pouches with magazines, a first aid kit, and a gas mask in its pouch on my leg, flak vest, and had my M16 slung on my shoulder, carrying a duffel bag crammed full of my utility uniforms, extra boots, civilian clothes, toiletries, shoes, and other stuff in one hand, and my clothing bag full of my dress uniforms in the other. We went up the ramp, out onto the flight deck, and into the back of a CH-53 Sea Stallion. We were crammed in 36 of us at a time with gear stacked all in our laps, and they handed us an inflatable life vest that we draped around our necks, unable to fasten the belt around our waist. We flew off the flight deck of the USS Cleveland LPD-7 and soon enough landed on the flight deck of the USS Peleliu LHA-5. We exited the helicopter out the ramp in the back, turning left as we went to avoid the tail rotor, and went down off the flight deck to a walkway that was below the level of the flight deck, then all the way around the ship and in through a hatch to the interior. We went down a few halls and through several hatches. We had too much gear to simply go through the small hatches. We had to pull the duffel bag in front of us and hold the clothing bag behind us, and then your rifle would get caught on the hatchway and you had to work that loose. By the time we reached our new berthing compartment, we were drenched in sweat. They had us hang up our clothing bags on racks and put our duffel bags in a space on the side of the ship with a slanted wall that was full of life preservers, and we were assigned a rack. They were nice racks that lifted and had a little bit of storage for a few utility uniforms and our toiletries underneath them. It was afternoon by the time we got settled, and most of us went to sleep just after chow at the new chow hall. They made their own bread on board the USS Peleliu LHA-5, and it was particularly good. The next morning was WOG Day, and I was a WOG. I put on 2 pairs of shorts under my uniform to protect me from the shillelaghs, a cut-off length of fire hose used by shellbacks to whip WOGs. WOGs had to put their utility uniform on inside out, with their underwear on the outside, and we had to crawl on all fours and could not walk upright. The first thing the shellbacks did was get all the WOGs wet. They lined us up in the bathroom on our knees the whole time, throwing buckets of water on us, and got a line of WOGs behind us and said, "Fuck them." There was no actual sex involved, just WOGs dry humping on each other's backs. It was a total humiliation. Lance Corporal Wolford went to pour spicy sauce down the back of my trousers and found my 2 pairs of shorts and yelled, "This WOG has padding," which brought the wrath of several shillelagh-wielding shellbacks on me. The Navy shellbacks would bring their fighting WOGs down to the Marine areas to match off with the Marine WOGs, and I got trapped in a WOG pile for a while. Then Lance Corporal Batalon took an interest in me and took me to chow. WOGs had to crawl through the line with a plastic foam plate in our mouth, and they served us plain noodles dyed green and slices of Spam that were half left uncooked and cold and half fried real hard. We had to eat this chow with our plate on the floor while on all fours. Then Batalon took me on a tour of the ship. I think he just wanted to explore the new ship we were on, but I got to know the USS Peleliu LHA-5 while crawling on my hands and knees. By the time Babylon got back to the other WOGs in Bravo Battery, they were emerging from the well deck up the ramp to the flight deck. Sergeant Roper saw me and said, "Grovel, grovel at my feet." So I crawled over to his feet and started saying, "Please, please, please." But I had had enough, and I bit his leg. He said, "This WOG just bit me." This brought an onslaught of shellbacks with shillelaghs, so I started barking and charging them and trying to bite them. They deemed me a special case WOG, and Wolford took me to the front of the line where the WOGs had lined up for the final ordeal out on the flight deck top side. First, you had to roll around in a box of food, then bob for onions in a toilet full of milk. The shellbacks then put you in stocks that held your neck and hands and beat you with shillelaghs on your backside until you read a sign on the ground in front of you that said, "I bet you pussy shellbacks can't make me say mama." You had to kiss the foot of Neptunus Rex that was covered in slime. And the worst thing, and last ordeal, was taking a cherry out of the belly button of the fattest sailor that was held in with lard with your teeth. Then it was over, and I could stand up, and there was a long pipe with a curved end that was used to fight fires hooked up to a hose, spraying salt water out ahead that made a shower of water on a flight deck elevator over the ocean, and you could wash off in this. I still had the cherry in my mouth, and after all I had been through, swallowing it did not seem unreasonable. But I came to my senses and spit it overboard. I think I was the first WOG in our battery to finish the initiation. After the WOGs were initiated, it was still morning, and everyone pitched in and had the ship spotless within the hour. By the time I found our compartment and had changed my clothes, they had already started cleaning. When I went back up on the flight deck, they had cleared all the gear used to torture the WOGs in the final initiation and had placed charcoal grills all along the flight deck and were cooking hamburgers and hot dogs for everybody. I was given a certificate signed by the captain of the ship and Neptunus Rex, the ruler of the raging main, to prove I was now a shellback. I also received a card to show to any other shellbacks that ever questioned my being a shellback also. We sailed south and went into the rough Indian Ocean and headed in the direction of Lebanon for about a week, then turned around and went to Australia. Chapter 23. Australia. First time. In early November 1983, we got to Australia. We had to wear our alpha dress uniforms to man the rails of the ship, and beforehand, we had a staff non-commissioned officer inspection, and Staff Sergeant Spittler inspected us in our alphas, dress uniform with long-sleeve shirt, tie, and dress jacket. When we pulled into Fremantle Harbor, all the sailors and Marines had to stand at parade rest, feet apart and hands behind the back, all along the rails of the ship. It was an impressive sight. We entered Fremantle Harbor, and the first thing I saw was two people at the entrance to the harbor with a sign that said, "Go away." After we manned the rails and docked the ship, I felt sorry for the boatswain mates who had to tie up the ship in their dress uniforms. We were lined up in the well deck in a line to exchange our money. There were Australians sitting at a desk and they exchanged our money. The exchange rates were around $1.12 US to $1 Australian or something like that. We were called by unit to exit the ship for liberty, and for the first 24 hours of port time, we had to wear our Charlie uniform, green trousers with short-sleeve khaki shirt, with ribbons and badges. I think because we were new to the ship, that is the reason our unit was the first called to go ashore for 5 days of liberty. Fremantle was a small town, and the main city of Perth was a few miles away. I got off the ship and walked down the street and saw a bus sitting there with the door open. I got on the bus and asked where it was going, and the driver said, "Perth." So I asked how much it was, and he said, "For you it is free." So I caught one of the first buses to Perth. Perth was a beautiful city. They had places called arcades where whole blocks had no automobile traffic and were full of shops. I went in one, and the first place I went was to a small restaurant, and I ordered a hamburger. I remember the guy behind the counter's accent and realized I was truly in Australia. I found a music shop and found something you could not find back in the United States. A cassette tape of Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, and it was pink and yellow. In the States, the album was pink and green. I went into shops that had roo skins. These were kangaroo leather skins. They had a long tail on them. I did not buy one. I went into a bar and a waitress came up and she was wearing a see-through negligee. I got a beer there but did not stay long. I mostly went to the movies during my first 5 days there. I saw Monty Python's Meaning of Life more than once and had a violet crumble candy bar from the concession stand each time. I met Lance Corporal Ross in town and we went to see a play at a theater, but he did not make it back in time from intermission and he had to watch the second part of the play from the back of the theater. I found a bookshop called the Magic Circle Bookshop and bought a book on casting astrology charts. I had a fire watch on the ship the third day, so I read the book and realized I needed 2 more books to cast a chart. So I went back to the Magic Circle Bookshop and got them. I believe one was a moon phase book called The Table of Houses. I forget what the third book was. I began to cast charts for the other Marines. I remember telling Staff Sergeant Spittler that he might have marriage problems from what was in his chart, and he agreed. We sailed out of Fremantle after around 5 days of liberty. Chapter 24, Outback. We went on a training exercise in the outback of Australia. This was a live fire exercise, complete with live ammunition for the howitzers. We went in on CH-46C night helicopters and had to carry all the stuff we needed. I was carrying the communication gear on the backpack frame that Pendleton and I won a meritorious mast for creating. Other Marines were carrying things like the gun sight in its box and the column meter in its case. The column meter is an optical device that looks like a telescope, but you point it at the howitzer from a few feet away and view down the big end of it through the gun sight, and you can see sighting lines with columns of numbers that you align the gun sight to. It is used to aim the howitzer in lieu of aiming stakes, which we put out also as a backup system. Marines were carrying the white and red striped aiming stakes also. The CH-47C night helicopter has 2 overhead rotors at either end. There is no tail rotor, so Marines walk straight into the back of it and do not have to avoid the tail rotor like on the CH-53C Stallion. I believe the CH-47C night holds about 26 Marines. We were still packed in tightly. The helicopter lifted off the flight deck, and we were on our way. The rotors counter-rotated, and this causes the whole helicopter to wobble in a twisting motion back and forth. It looks like it is going to shake apart. There are 3 small round windows along the side of the compartment running down both sides and a larger open square window further up front on the right side that an air crewman is stationed at. Our helicopter was making banking turns, and all you could see out of the 3 round windows was light blue sky when we turned one way and dark blue water when we turned the other. This went on for a while, and then, out of the windows we began to see the light blue sky. But the dark blue water was replaced with green as we were over a grassy area. We landed and the ramp on the back opened and we had to quickly exit the helicopter. I went to stand up and felt something pulling me to the left. I looked and Lance Corporal Shaw's helmet strap was caught on the handle of the comm wire spool on my communications gear backpack, and in trying to get loose it pulled the metal shell of his helmet off and it fell on the floor of the helicopter. I looked back while leaving and saw the ramp closing and his helmet shell still in there, and it flew off with the helicopter to who knows where. The rest of the time in the field, he just wore his liner. We were in a green, grassy, open field, and I watched as a CH-53C Stallion helicopter, the larger of the 2 cargo helicopters, brought in a small 4x4 forklift hanging down from a strap. There were 2 types of all-terrain 4x4 forklifts that the engineers had, and this was the smaller one. There were Marines on the ground under the helicopter to take the straps off when the helicopter released them. They then began to bring in our howitzers in the same way, and as they were released from the CH-53C Stallion that brought them, the forklift would go over and move them into position by picking up the trails and pulling the gun to its new spot. This went on until the whole battery of 6 guns was in position. Someone said when we first got there that he saw a kangaroo run away, but I never saw it. A CH-47C night then came in with a net underneath that had boxes of ammo. Marines were there to unhook the net, and they began to carry the ammo to the guns. I had passed off the comm gear backpack to Lance Corporal Colescott, a Marine on my gun section. The advanced party Marines, whom I was a member of, were put on outer perimeter watch at once, and we watched as all the other Marines that were working hard to carry ammo to load and fire the guns. We were only there on the grassy field a few hours before they began to pack up. I was given the communications backpack again and was in the first helicopter that came. We flew to a large plateau that was tan, brown, and rocky. There were these burnt prehistoric-looking plants with a woody rough trunk and green spiky fronds coming out of the top. They were not burnt, as I later learned. The locals called them black boy cactuses, but the scientific name is Xanthorrhoea australis. The helicopters came in and brought the forklift and all the guns. But this time there were huge clouds of sand and dirt kicked up by the helicopters. Again, I was on outer perimeter watch and saw the poor souls who had to unhook the straps from the helicopters in the clouds of dust. A CH-53 Sea Stallion brought in a large load of ammo in a net, and I watched those poor souls brave the dust to unhook the strap, then start hauling the ammo over to the guns. I believe these were all the Marines who had gotten in trouble, and most of them had been busted down to private, because I saw Private Hancock's, Private Griffin, Private Copeland, and Private Banks in this detail, and they were all from different platoons. There were 3 Marines assigned to my outer perimeter watch location. I believe they were Lance Corporal High, Lance Corporal Stevens, and myself, Lance Corporal Poe. Only one of us had to be awake so the other 2 could sleep. We were at this location for 3 days. The first day, Staff Sergeant Spittler, who oversaw the advance party and security, came up to me and said, "Come with me, I have a present for you." He took me back to the perimeter where they had dug a fighting position and had a M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun with a night vision sight on it. He took the night vision sight, which was huge, off the gun and gave it to me. We had dug a hole that I slept in for the 3 days we were there, but this was back a bit in the sand and not on the rocky outcropping of our outer perimeter position. They said that it did not rain where we were in the outback, but Typhoon Alice came through and it rained every day while we were there. Nobody had brought any rain gear, so it was a bad experience. That first night I had the first watch after dark. There was supposed to be a recon platoon in the area with some SEALs that were supposedly going to assault us with rubber knives, and we had to be on the lookout for them. Lance Corporal High said, "What good is a rubber knife when you are hit with a metal aiming stake?" The huge night vision scope did not have a stand, and so I sat down and placed it on my knees so I could look through it. And off in the distance I saw a Marine building a fire. So I told Staff Sergeant Spittler, and he went down there to investigate. He said it was a road guard, and he crept all the way up to him and scared him. After my watch, I went to sleep in my hole. I woke up a little while later to voices. It was Lance Corporal High, and he had seen something in the bushes. Staff Sergeant Spittler took out a pop-up flare. The kind he had was for illuminating an area and had a flare on a parachute. Other pop-up flares were for signaling and were marked things like Green Star Cluster or Red Star. The one he had was supposed to fly up and over an area and illuminate it so you could see the area. He took the cap off and put it on the bottom of the tube like you're supposed to, and hit the cap with the palm of his hand to launch it into the air. It was windy on the plateau because of the typhoon, and the flare was blown sideways back to the perimeter and landed on the ground, and all it illuminated was the guys at the M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun. We never found out what Lance Corporal High had seen in the night scope. There were flies everywhere and black ants all over the ground that did not really sting. The flies were stupid, and you could catch them easily. So we would catch flies and pull their wings off and throw them on the ground and see how long they lasted before the ants got them. It was hot during the day and cold at night, and it had been raining. I woke up one morning and could not get my feet warm. We are issued heat tablets that burn and heat up food. I took one and broke it in half and put each piece on the toe of each boot and lit them on fire. I called them my Tasmanian toe warmers. We were there for 3 days. And on the last day, as we were packing up and they were rigging the howitzers for the airlift, the recon platoon came walking in because they would take the helicopters out of this area also. We had never seen them. One of them was humping a 5-gallon black water jug. They never assaulted us with rubber knives. They probably just made a call for an airstrike on the position. We boarded our helicopters, and I was one of the first ones to leave. We landed on board the USS Peleliu LHA-5, disembarked from the helicopters, and were directed to a hangar deck where they lined us all up in rows and had us lay out our gear in front of us and strip down to our underwear. We were exhausted, and there was a general bad attitude to this treatment. Then, Navy corpsmen came and inspected our bodies for ticks, while other corpsmen sprayed our gear with tick killer. Then we were allowed to collect our gear and go to our berthing compartment. Chapter 25. Australia second time. We pulled into port at Fremantle a second time. and we were there for 4 days. We had a total of 9 days liberty in Australia split in half by our 4-day stint training in the outback. We did not have to man the rails this time, and this time there was a British aircraft carrier group there. I went out and caught a bus to Perth. In Perth, I met Lance Corporal Palliath and Lance Corporal Ferguson in town, and they were spending time together with a tall local young lady with two-tone hair. Two-toned hair seemed to be all the rage among the younger adults. We went to an ice cream parlor and had ice cream. I was acting foolish, and she was jokingly calling me Trouble. After the ice cream parlor, they said they were going back to Fremantle, but I had just gotten to Perth and we parted ways. I saw Corporal Baggy, and he wanted to get a tattoo at a crowded tattoo parlor. He wanted one they had on the wall there that was a skull wearing a cowboy hat and wearing a bandana, and the bandana was a Confederate flag. The tattoo parlor was full, and he could not get in. So we found another tattoo shop that was in an out-of-the-way place and did not have anyone in it. There were 2 Australian men in the shop, and Baggy tried to explain what he wanted. One of the men quickly drew a skull with a cowboy hat wearing a bandana, but it was not as cool as the one in the crowded shop, so he did not get it. I left Baggy and I walked around for a while. I went to a postal museum and looked around. It was in the old part of Perth, and they had ornate carvings on all the architecture. In the postal museum, they had a coconut that someone many years ago had carved a message on and had sent through the mail. It had a canceled stamp on it. I then went to the movies and saw Monty Python's The Meaning of Life for a 4th time, and again had a violet crumble candy bar and a soda. I had a fire watch the next day on the ship, so I got a taxi back to Fremantle, and the whole way there the white taxi driver told me racist jokes about Aboriginals. I got back to the ship and went to sleep for a while. When I woke up, Private Griffin asked if he could borrow my black leather pants that I had bought at the Galleria Mall in Houston right after boot camp with the money I had made. I loaned them to him and did my fire watch that day. I stayed on the ship another night and went back to Perth on a train. Some young people had their bicycles with them, and they were allowed to take them on the train but had to pay double. I met Lance Corporal Ross in Perth, and we went to Swan Lake, which had a park, and lounged around all day. I told him I wanted to move to Australia. That afternoon, I caught a bus back to Fremantle because all the Marines had to be on the ship the next day because it was November 10th, the Marine Corps birthday. That morning, at 0600, 6 a.m., we mustered in our Charlie uniforms, short-sleeve dress shirts with ribbons and badges, on the dock at Fremantle, and at 0700, 7 a.m., we had a parade for ourselves. After the parade, I spent time on the ship until chow time when the Navy fed us steak and lobster. Then I got ready for our last night in Australia. Pendleton and Grom and I went out and took a taxi to Perth. We went to a bar we had heard about called Hannibal's. It was a big fancy bar, and there were British sailors there from the British aircraft carrier. I was washing my hands in the bathroom, and I said, "Hey, the water stays on." And a British sailor beside me said, "Yes, it is not like on a ship." We drank a lot of Swan beer at Hannibal's, but we left before the evening was over. I went with Pendleton and Grom, and we hopped on Pendleton's dime as he had forgotten the exchange rate, and I was no help because I often fake drank after I was a little drunk. We went to a bar with hostesses that you could buy drinks for with a Marilyn Monroe picture on the back wall. We did not know what kind of bar it was at first, but soon a young woman sat down with us. And then another woman sat down also. We had been drinking in Hannibal's bar before this, so Pendleton was drunk and buying rounds thinking 13.1 the exchange rate that was in the Philippines, but we were in Australia, which was more than $1 US to $1 Australian. We closed that bar and Grom said, "I am interested in Susan," who was the second woman to sit at our table and the most aggressive about getting drinks. He went over to her and asked her something as she was getting ready to leave as the bar closed. When he came back to us, we were like, "What did you say to her?" And he said he asked her if she was still working, but he was shot down. Then we went outside that bar and were on the street, and a drag queen in a taxi yelled at us and asked if we wanted to smoke a joint, and Pendleton in his drunken state went into a rage and chased the taxi away. We then went to a convenience store that had a few video games, and I remember some young girl giving me instructions on how to play the video game before quickly disappearing. Then we went to an all-night Italian restaurant and ate. And the owner came and sat with us, and he was from Italy and barely spoke English. We offered him some wine, but he declined. His son came over and apologized after we were done, but we all told him it was no problem. We then got a taxi back to Fremantle and went back to the USS Peleliu LHA-5. Whenever we were drunk and in a strange town, it was a welcome sight to see the big lighted 5 all off in the distance, knowing we would be back on board our ship soon. Before we left, Pendleton found out he had spent around $300 that last night and was broke. We sailed the next morning out of Fremantle Harbor for the last time, and I sadly said goodbye to Australia forever.